That was a great introduction. Thank you very much, and glad you all came out. And yeah, I was really excited to see this idea for a lecture series. It's a nice way of getting to know one another across the different departments and faculty and staff and students alike. And yeah, I've gotten a lot of comments about my title, and so I've decided not to give this talk. It's really something dear to my heart to combine these sorts of things. I am a scientist by training, but that doesn't mean that I'm a scientist by personality. I find I'm actually more right-brained than my colleagues are in the sciences. So I like to put things together. I'm a grouper rather than a splitter. I try and look for links between lots of strange, extraneous ideas and put them together into something that hopefully has substance. So at the end of the talk, I'll check in with you and make sure that I've done that, because that's my goal. So let's see. Before I get started, actually I'm going to flip back here to my title slide, because I do have some caveats. Number one, I arrived at St. Vincent only 4 years ago. So, I'm not a Catholic. I'm a Presbyterian. So I am just telling you that I'm fairly new to the Benedictine tradition of St. Vincent College. I'm finding comfort in these traditions as I look at them, these different values that have been published in the college literature. But I am by no means an expert in these values. So it'll be a nice conversation, maybe at the end, and you can maybe share your perspective on these values as well as my perspective. I also, let's see, I do like woodpeckers, so a lot of my examples might be woodpeckers. Got some crows to talk about too. When you get to do your own talk, you can talk about what you liked, and so I'll be fairly general with birds, but the woodpeckers always creep in. Another caveat is I'm not talking as a scientist tonight. Science is value neutral, and so science is about evaluating data. It's very black and white. Testing hypotheses, collecting data, and seeing if those hypotheses can be supported or not. When we talk about values, that's rather a different sort of thing than collecting data and trying to prove hypotheses correct or reject them. So I am taking my scientist hat off, and now I'm just talking to you about someone who studies birds, and again, not necessarily from a scientific point of view. So I gave you a handout with these 9 different Benedictine values. I am a little embarrassed to say that there's no citation. I obviously didn't write this. When I was preparing this talk, I was looking for a nice condensed listing of the Benedictine values, and what did I do? I went and asked a student. I said, well, do you know where I can get a list of these Benedictine values? And the student said, absolutely. So I was very proud of him. And so this is the document that we downloaded, and I regret that I didn't actually ask him where he got it from. He's a prefect, and it was in the introductory material, the instructional material that the prefects were given. Right. Good. Well, but I'm still an academic, I'm afraid. Okay, well, those caveats aside, let's get started. We're going to talk about first couple rather quickly. I'm not able to relate the study of birds to all of them, all of the values. But and in particular, the one that I can't do the most is love of Christ and neighbor. I'd love to think that birds love Christ and their neighbor, but we can't ask them that. And scientist or not, that's just something that we can't evaluate. A lot of people, though, see the Benedictine value of love of Christ and neighbor in birds. People who aren't trained in animal behavior, they might see birds that appear to be comforting their mate, or raising their offspring. These things appear very loving. It comes, that's where the phrase lovebirds comes from. But when these are investigated scientifically, these often turn out to be very selfish things. That if you are raising your offspring, then sure, you're caring for your offspring, but you are part of your offspring from a genetic sense. So it's selfish there. Love maybe, but it's selfish love. And that goes true here as well for taking care of the mate. By investing in the mate, you're investing in your opportunity for breeding. And so if you were to not protect your mate and the mate would die, then that's kind of bad news for you. So from a biology point of view, it's not really love exactly. I have this picture of the robin and the robin nest here, a picture that I took of the same nest. This was outside of a house where I was living up in Vermont. And the same nest, a few weeks earlier, it was snowing. It was before the leaves had come out. The robin had started the nesting season rather early, or maybe it was a late snow, I don't remember. But it was very, very cold, and of course, before the chicks hatch, you have the eggs, and the eggs have to be incubated. They have to be kept warm, and it was snowing, and so, of course, the mama robin was sitting on the nest incubating the eggs. Well, guess what the father robin was doing? The father was sitting on the mother who was sitting on the eggs. The father was caring for its mate and its future offspring by trying to incubate. So it was two parents sitting one on top of each other, sitting on the eggs to keep them warm during that winter time. So that's as much love as I can talk about from a point of view of the birds. Hospitality, I thought maybe I'd throw hospitality in that same category as not really being able to see this in birds, because a lot of behavior, birds do interact with strangers in a flock. They don't just interact with their family members, they interact with lots of neighbors and strangers, and usually when they do, it's fairly aggressive. It's they're competing for resources. So you set up a dominance hierarchy where the resident bird, the one that is familiar with the habitat, it kind of takes what it wants and leaves the crumbs for the stranger. And the stranger knows this, so the stranger doesn't even bother trying to get into the food source until the resident is finished. Well, so I thought maybe that's all I would say about hospitality, but it turns out that over the summer there was a recent article about crows that demonstrated that birds very well might interact with others in a way that benefits the other. And that is a wonderful illustration of the Benedictine value of hospitality. What I'm talking about in particular are crows. And here's a friend of mine. Up in Ithaca, New York, there's a big study on crows that was going on. And so my friend would climb up into this tree. So this is about 30 or 40 or 50 feet up. And these, although they look really big, these are little baby crows. They are a few weeks old, or a lot of weeks old, but they have not left the nest yet. They're just sitting there, and my friend Andrew, he pops up there, and these little baby crows, they've never seen a person before, they don't know what's going on, so they don't really act afraid, of course, until he tries to grab them. But he'd climb up to the nest, bring these little chicks down to the ground, put bands on their legs so we can identify the individuals. Meanwhile, of course, the parents are circling and calling and being very, very aggressive and mad. What is this human doing up in our tree? And so this is a very memorable and stressful experience, particularly for the parents. But it turns out that the parents and the little chicks here, they remember this person's face. The person who was causing all of this harm is remembered, their facial characteristics. So let me read a very brief outline of this study. Not though this was a picture from my work up in Ithaca, New York, but the study I'm going to tell you about happened in the state of Washington at Willamette University. So let's see. So here's a researcher named Craig. He joined a team of researchers from the University of Washington to study crows' ability to distinguish among my printer cut off the edge of the paper. So I can't read this to you. I'm just going to have to relate what the article is talking about. At any rate, researchers climbed up to these nests with a mask on. And it was a mask of a caveman. And actually, here we go. This is an awkward photo, but here's this person wearing a mask. And this person would climb up to the nest, grab these chicks, put maybe radio transmitters on the crows. Eventually they get put back in the nest, and the parents come back and take care of them. It's a traumatic experience for the birds, though. And so from then on, anyone who donned the mask was harassed by the crows. It didn't matter who wore the mask. It didn't matter the size of the person, or the gender of the person, how they walked. It was simply the fact that they were wearing the mask. And these crows would harass this person, whoever was wearing that mask. So the crows clearly recognized this as a danger or some sort of risk. So not only did, let's see, when the researchers who had done the trapping wore a mask the crows had not seen before. So not this caveman mask, but some other mask. For instance, one of Dick Cheney. That's what it says. They found that the crows ignored the person. So it's the facial characteristics of the mask of the person who's actually causing the harm the crows remembered. Not only did they recognize these dangerous people, but they remembered them for a long time. Almost 3 years after going up to this nest, disturbing the nest, 3 years later, you wear that same mask, the crow remembers and attacks you. Not only that, but the crows shared their knowledge with other crows. Crows that were nowhere near the trapping incident also harassed people wearing this mask, even though they were born, even though the crows were born in another location. So here we have crows apparently talking to other crows, telling the crows about this evil guy with a mask on. And it gets communicated socially and passed on to offspring even. One of the most surprising parts of the study was the persistence of the crows' negative reactions over time. And it was also surprising that the crows passed to other crows and to their offspring. So it's a socially communicated sort of thing. This seems hospitable to me. Now, there's probably some relatedness between these crows, but it's hard to know. I have a little joke there. Crows are not hospitable to someone wearing a caveman mask, so hospitality can go both ways. Well, moving on. Right. Moving on to the next Benedictine value of prayer. I'm not about to assert that birds pray, but researchers who study the birds follow prayer, maybe not a spoken prayer to God, but in the spirit of Lectio Divina, which is, as you can see, careful reading, reflection, openness to God's presence. All of this, a spirit of mindfulness, a spirit of a mindfulness of creation and of the almightiness of God's creatures. This is experienced, at least by me, when I'm out in the woods watching birds. Whether I'm watching a bird feeder or doing some of my more science research, this is quiet time, reflective time. This photo of the bird feeder is kind of faded. It's old. It's like from 1984. And this is my parents' my backyard growing up. And I put it in there to show that it's a lifelong interest of mine. And not just an interest, not an intellectual interest, but a spiritual devotion to studying birds. When I would watch this bird feeder, then there'd be lots of birds, obviously, to watch. And here's some photos. All of these are mine except the mourning doves. This is a shot that I grabbed off the net, mostly because we got a group of doves there. And they, as a boy, we'd often have lots of mourning doves at the base of our bird feeder. And the doves are really silly birds, if you'll forgive me for saying, or if they'll forgive me for saying, because if one of them sees a person walking by and gets upset, then it starts to take off, and it flaps its wings real loud, and it gives a sort of a really upset alarm call, and even if, say, this dove doesn't see what's upsetting this dove, it's going to respond, and it's going to fly away too. And so, as a boy, I'd always just like to scare away those doves, and then just say, "Oh, you stupid doves." But they were behaving properly. If someone yelled fire in the theater, which you're not supposed to do, you're not going to look around for the fire. You're just going to leave, and that's what the doves are doing. So these are observations of the birds that I would do as a child, and that ultimately led to more scientific endeavors. For instance, catching woodpeckers in traps, tree trunk-mounted traps that I built as a graduate student. And we have a little piece of suet in there, which is basically animal fat. And I've got a red-bellied woodpecker in my hand right there that was attracted to the suet, entered the trap, and I was hanging out in a bird blind like this, just kind of a tent that I built myself. And from this window, one of these windows, I'd have a fishing line go to that trap. And when I'd see a bird that I wanted to catch, I'd pull a fishing line, trap would close, and then I'd run up there and grab the bird out of the trap. I would do this 2 hours a day, every day of my graduate school career. And it was the most favorite part of graduate school. Just sitting there, just waiting for the birds to come. If you are a hunter or a fisher, you know what I'm talking about, because you just wait for the animal to come. And this is prayer in the Benedictine sense of the word. Another sense of this, or in a similar way, some of my later research on crows, just a few years ago, just before I got to St. Vincent, I was at Franklin and Marshall College and involved in a study of crows with my colleagues at Penn State. And so this is one of our field researchers, and his name's Doug. And we'd catch some crows, we'd put little radio transmitters on them. That's what these antennae are. And even though this guy looks really nice, if you got anywhere close to his beak, he'd really bite you bad. I understand that, though. A big human being, relatively small bird, I'd want to bite too. Well, this was great, and of course to catch these crows, we'd have to wait as well. Instead of using suet, we'd use Cheetos. We'd throw Cheetos in a cornfield, and when a crow or more than one crow would descend on the Cheetos to begin eating, we would fire off a cannon net, and the net would spread over the group of crows and catch them all at once. So that was some waiting, some quiet time, and then of course it would end with a big boom. But the best thing that I want to share with you is not the actual telemetry work and handling the crows, which was a wonderful love of mine. But I want to direct your attention to this graph here. This is the number of crows that would gather at dusk And these are actual individuals here, the best we can do. But look at the scale here. It goes from maybe 15,000 to 45,000. Can you imagine 45,000 crows all in one cornfield, or all in one neighborhood, or one shopping center, which is actually where they tended to congregate? That's a lot of crows, and it was just amazing. It was just amazing. I can't find the words to describe how amazing this sight was. Let's see, I guess it was Daryl that made the joke about Alfred Hitchcock's The Birds. Believe it or not, I have not seen that film. Well, I haven't seen the film, but I've seen what Alfred Hitchcock put together, because it's a real thing. Every black dot on the screen is a crow. How many crows are in there? Yeah, I know. It's impossible to tell. But we would do the best we could. Actually, we wouldn't count them once they descended here all in one group, because you really can't distinguish, how many crows are in this tree. We would count them as they came in to roost in the late afternoon. So it would be just a steady stream of crows. I never took, this is not my photo, I never took any photos of this because I didn't want to block my view ever with a camera. I never even thought of taking photos of this phenomenon because it was just so spectacular. So I went to YouTube and I thought maybe I could find something that was similar, and I think I did. This video unfortunately has like some aircraft noise in it, but it'll do the trick. I'm going to try and expand that. Sorry. Play that. Here we go. An error occurred. Okay. Well, see, you'll never know how spectacular the crows were. I suspect this is the wireless internet, so I suspect something happened there. But let me describe it. You can see, briefly at least, you saw the crows were just flying. It was crows everywhere. You read stories about like passenger pigeons blocking the sun because they were so dense. The crows would do this, except of course the sun was setting. But not only the cacophony of the calls, all these individuals are just calling to their heart's delight, but they would swoop around like these giant flocks of birds. And when they do that, you would hear their wings. It would just be this swooshing sound as they'd fly around. And they'd settle in a tree, and then some individual in that flock would decide that this wasn't the tree for them. So they'd leave, and then all the buddies would get up and all fly together from one tree to another. It would take hours for them to settle down. And again, 50,000 birds, all in basically 1 or 2 acres of land.
Did you ever walk through them with a caveman mask on?
No caveman mask. Nope. Boy, that would be something, wouldn't it? That is one hypothesis about why they actually form these giant flocks. There might be one owl out there, or a few owls. And owls are a major predator of crows. And so they form these big flocks basically to dilute the chance of ever getting eaten by an owl, or to scare the owl away. Well, that's my view of prayer. It's a very personal thing, and I could go on and on about it. But I need to move on to another Benedictine value that, honestly, I hadn't heard before. Do the monks not talk about this one? Conversatio. As you refer to your, and maybe I should be embarrassed that I haven't heard about this one before, but referring to the description of this, it is a way of life the willingness to be shaped together day after day through all the other Benedictine values that are listed here. It's the development of the whole, and it says whole human being, but allow me to convert this into birds. It is the development of, I have a slide here showing the development of birds from when they hatch. They're like really ugly and they're very helpless. And then they get feathers and they're more cute now. And then they finally leave the nest and they follow their parents around and they're still really cute. They're begging and they learn from their parents where to find food and what's danger and what's not. And then eventually they become full adults and they breed and they continue the cycle, the reproductive cycle. This is a transformation of an individual from an egg to a youngster to an adult. This might not be exactly what was intended when St. Benedict was talking about conversiato, but this is my view as a biologist about what conversiato might be. The development of an individual. You learn things and you improve constantly, and you become unique, but yet still a bird of a particular species. That's one way of looking at it. Another a way to look at it from a biology point of view would be evolution. You can start with maybe a proto-bird, such as Archaeopteryx. This is a photo from Carnegie Natural History Museum. Here's Archaeopteryx, which actually this is, so this is kind of a dinosaur, but kind of a bird. A lot of bird biologists would say, well, same thing. True. Birds are modern-day dinosaurs, and none of you are going, ooh, really? And I always get that response. I try and talk to children about birds, and I say, well, you know what? You like dinosaurs, don't you? Oh, yeah. Well, then you're going to like birds. And they're like, what are you talking about? But from an evolutionary point of view, birds are dinosaurs, and this is just an early ancestor of our modern birds. Archaeopteryx, even though this looks like a dinosaur with feathers, nasty teeth right there and big claws and whatnot. How big do you think Archaeopteryx was? Maybe like, this big? No, Archaeopteryx was about this big. And he could fly. And evolutionary change would, in my view, qualify as conversatio. The development from one form to another, the steady progression from one form to another, lose the teeth, lose at least the claws on the forelimbs, and maybe get bigger wings, lower the tail a little bit, change the pelvis, and you've got a bird. Oh, well, you got to change the position of the toes there. You got to switch the toes around, but otherwise, you got a bird. So through evolutionary time, the steady changing, transformation, transformative change from one kind of life to another. So for stability, I think actually one could consider maybe evolution as something that's stable too, even though it constantly changes. At any given moment it stays the same, but that's for another discussion. I have one of my favorite bird species shown here, the pileated woodpecker, which, now that I think about it, is about the same size as Archaeopteryx. It's a big bird. And I did my college thesis, my capstone project on those two birds right there, and then throw another handful of individuals in there. We actually had a pileated woodpecker roosting on campus up in Maine. That's where College of the Atlantic is. And the bird, unlike those crows that would all kind of just perch in a tree at night, woodpeckers spend the night in a hollow tree. And it's just one bird per tree, or one hole anyway, one bird per hole. And stability here is, of course, a particular progression of steps, maybe during the day, the dailiness of life. And for birds, they have a very dailiness of life. They wake up, they leave the roost, they go foraging, they avoid predators, they eat more through foraging, and then the sun sets and they go back to roost again. That's their typical day, at least in the non-breeding period. And so these woodpeckers here, I would watch this hole right here. This is a hollow tree. I would watch it, another bird blind that I showed you before. And I would just sit and wait again for maybe 90 minutes before sunset. And you never knew when the bird was coming, but you knew it was going to come at some point, whether it was 90 minutes before sunset, maybe even 10 or 15 minutes after sunset. That sort of span of time it would come, and it would go in the hole. And part of my senior thesis was looking at the climate, the microclimate, the weather conditions that would happen during this day, and whether I could relate the time of going to roost to certain weather conditions during that day. So, did the bird go to roost on a particularly cold day, or a particularly warm day, or a particularly windy day, that sort of thing. Well, part of my project was to look at the temperature, not just outside of this roost, but I climbed up here on a ladder, drilled a hole into this tree on the other side. Unfortunately, you can't see it. But I drilled a hole right there, and I inserted a thermometer, a digital thermometer with a, these days it would be wireless, but I had a cord that would come down. And I had a thermometer that would plug in. So from my spot, 30 yards away, I could read what temperature it was inside that roost cavity when the bird entered. And the first day that I did that, of course, the woodpecker didn't know what that was. It went in the cavity, and I'm watching the thermometer, and the thermometer is like, let's say it was 35 degrees Fahrenheit. And then it started to go up to 40 degrees Fahrenheit. I thought, yeah, this is great. The bird is warming up its cavity. And the temperature would start to keep going higher. It was like 50 degrees. I thought, geez, I didn't realize that it was going to get that warm. Meanwhile, I hear this pecking sound, and the temperature is going higher and higher. Eventually gets above 100 degrees Fahrenheit. And I think there's something wrong here. Well, the woodpecker went in there, saw this weird thing sticking in its cavity, and it began to peck at my thermometer, removed the insulation from the thermometer, and so the temperature finally went 150 degrees before it kicked out and read nothing. But that's just a fun story about this woodpecker project. Mostly, the stability has to do with the woodpecker coming in, spending the night, and going away. There was one other thing about this is the bird on the left here is a female. She has a black forehead and kind of lacks the red. You can see some red right here. That's called a Mauer stripe. So this is a male here. He's got red on his cheeks. The female doesn't. The two of them would approach the roost together, which was something I was looking at. They'd eventually go to their separate holes, but it was, again, stability. The mate was always there, and you'd always go to bed with the mate and get up in the morning, and you'd vocalize from the cavity entrance, and your mate would greet you. So just a very regular sort of thing happening. Another way to illustrate stability in the lives of birds would be to study their home ranges, because they're territorial. They just spend the same, they spend their lives in one small area. So I got some radio telemetry equipment, and I was able to draw little patterns on a map. This is a map of my study site. And so there's one male woodpecker lived in this spot. His, I can't say his whole life, but at least for one summer when I was studying it. And here's another male, and this is the space that he would use. And so stability, they got familiar with the habitat. Another example doesn't have to do with woodpeckers or even my own research, but came to mind hummingbirds. Stability. They have a regularness of their daily activities. You know, hummingbirds love to visit hummingbird feeders and drink the nectar, but of course this is their real food source, the nectar that comes out of flowers. And the flowers have a dailiness. They open and they close during the day. You can, if a hummingbird came in here, stuck its beak down into that flower and took up the nectar, then the hummingbird wouldn't get any nectar if it came back to the same flower half an hour later. You have to wait for that nectar to replenish within the plant. And so people have done studies on hummingbirds, and the hummingbirds they're like engineers, not engineers, they're like people on the train, you know, they keep the train on time. Hummingbird visits this patch of flowers at 10 a.m. and it goes over there to that patch of flowers at 11 a.m. and that patch of flowers at noon, and then, you know, maybe by 3 it comes back to this patch of flowers. That's stability for you. Sometimes in our busy lives, we'd like to have that sort of stability. Stability on a broader scale wouldn't necessarily be dailiness, but rather seasonal patterns. Migration happens over and over and over, as does reproduction for birds. And molt, they lose their feathers on a regular annual or semi-annual basis. One interesting thing about the seasonality of birds is that they go through puberty and menopause every year. Their reproductive hormones are basically nothing during the non-breeding season, and then puberty happens. We don't call it puberty in the bird world, but basically the reproductive hormones go up. You have courtship, you have mating, and then you have kids. And the hormones go way back down. And they don't go back up again until it's time to re-engage that mate and have courtship and mating take place. So that's stability over and over and over again. These are data from my Downy Woodpecker project. Testosterone level in males would peak in the month of April when a lot of mating was taking place. Moving on to humility, I have 2 examples here. One example of humility for birds is simply the fact that they die. And they die sooner than you would expect. Small little birds that might visit your bird feeder, they have a 50% mortality rate each year. You know, they have a 50% chance of making it 1 year. And, you know, some of that mortality is due to the fact that they get eaten. Here's a starling. And I loved the fact that this Cooper's hawk here came and ate the starling right outside my window one time. And so here's the starling. You can see like the skull there and the blood coming out of the skull. This was PG-rated talk, sorry. But here's this hawk, and you know, the starling bit the dust. No more starling. And we are all mortal. And so we live our lives in a way that's you know, we are not anywhere close to being perfect or immortal. And so we just live one day at a time, and so do the birds. And so that's one sort of example of humility that I was thinking about. Whether it's predation here or actually the birds that do migrate. Not all birds migrate, by the way, but many of them do. When they do migrate, migration is really dangerous. And so there's a lot of mortality related to that. They might be crossing the Gulf of Mexico, and they have to do that in one night. I mean, there's no place to stop. Actually, I do have well, they very well might stop on ships. I'm familiar with that, actually. But they can't predict that there's going to be a ship right there when they get tired. So there's probably a fair number of birds that just don't make it. They run out of fuel, and they fall into the Gulf of Mexico. And then, of course, the birds that don't migrate. It's cold outside, and they might, in fact, starve overnight. they have to be able to fly. So they can't store up food or fat like a bear or a groundhog can, because the groundhog is kind of roly-poly thing anyway. It doesn't have to fly. So when they say that birds are rats with wings, it's not true. Because a rat can gain weight and lots of weight and it can't fly. The bird has very limited ability to gain weight and keep it there. And so they literally do starve to death in one night, some of them. Hopefully not all of them. So this is something that I was thinking about with regards to humility. Then, of course, there's the humility of the researcher, too. When I was studying the downy woodpecker for my doctoral dissertation, I put radio transmitters on their backs. And again, they have to be able to fly, so the radio transmitter can't be very heavy, or else they don't fly very well. And so here I radioed 136 individuals during my doctoral work. And so I kind of am cautious to show this slide because a few of them died while I was studying them. And basically, it's about 10% of them did. If you add up these 6 right here, and those 3, and those 2, and that one, it's about 13 birds that I have records of when they died. They died during the first month of wearing the radio. And most of them, if I found a dead bird, it was within the first 3 days of wearing that radio. Some of them were what's called depredated. They were eaten by a hawk or an owl. And I would know that because I'd be using my radio telemetry equipment, and I'd be listening to the transmission of the transmitter. It goes beep, beep, beep. And eventually the signal would be coming from the ground, and that's kind of a bad sign. And I'd eventually find a little pile of feathers, maybe some feet, and a little radio transmitter in the middle of that mess. That was it. You know, the rest of the bird had been consumed, but just a little pile of feathers, and it would always be a sorrowful experience for the researcher. From a scientific point of view, darn, you know, one less bird that I can throw into my data set. But it was very personal because I would be following this bird on a daily basis. I'd get to know it, and it would be eaten. There's going to be some predation that happens all the time, but see, there's like 1, 2, 3, 4 birds that got eaten within the first 3 days. That's a little bit higher than any other time period. So some of that had to do with the radio transmitter. The radio transmitter, the bird hadn't adjusted to it. It was a little bit too heavy, perhaps. And so some of this is natural, but some of this I caused. Not on purpose, but nevertheless. And so this was certainly something, you know, when I look at the description of humility here, accountability is part of humility. I had to account for the fact that I caused harm to the animals that I loved and was studying. Also, you'll note that died in roost. These are the birds that starved overnight. And if they were going to run out of fuel, they did it within the first week. After that, the bird's body had gained enough muscle and it had adjusted to wearing the transmitter. So I caused some mortality of the same birds that I loved and wanted to study. So that certainly would remind me that I was not perfect, and that's humility. Obedience, just a short one slide, no pictures. Speaking of predation, well, before I get to obedience, I have to tell you the story of a female RG, red-green. That's what her color bands were on her legs. I could distinguish her. She was one bird that it wasn't an issue of the transmitter being too heavy, but rather the way you attach the transmitter. It's like a backpack, except it would loop around the legs rather than the wings. And I apparently made a mistake when I tied that on the bird. And so the bird's feet, actually, maybe it was just 1 foot. I think it was 1 foot got tangled in the thread that I used to tie, it had to have been both feet actually, tie the transmitter on that bird. And so, and it didn't happen right away, but it must have been loose enough that she was able to get her foot in there. And so after, day number 2 or so, I was following her around, and I discovered that she could not land. She would just flutter from this branch to that branch to that branch. She couldn't work her legs. And that was horrible, just horrible to watch. I tried to recapture her, for days and days and days. Finally, and thankfully, she got eaten. First of all, the harm that I caused her was over, and that it all went to a good cause. It went and fed some owl or hawk. Just a gut-wrenching experience. All right, well, that predator would go after a bird that was acting strangely, and it goes after other birds that are not wearing radio transmitters, because it's a very natural process. And so obedience here, when I read about obedience, the first word of St. Benedict's rule is listen. And listening is a necessary skill and attitude for Benedictine wisdom. The students must learn to listen well in order to respond to the demands of an intentional life. Well, birds have to listen in order to respond to the environment around them. They have to be tuned in to the presence of predators. So a lot of times when you see a bird, it's just perched. It's just perched in a tree. It's not seeming to do anything, but it's doing something. It's listening. It's looking around. It's looking for danger. It's trying to judge conditions to see if it's safe to go out and look for food or interact with a mate, something like that. So this bird is being obedient to the demands that are placed upon it by the presence of predators. Just 2 more. Discipline. So the easy definition of discipline is, of course, kind of like following instructions. Well, not only that, but also being disciplined. I think of my woodpecker again. The woodpeckers are like dentists that are cleaning teeth. They go around and they go around, there's this, the bark on a tree, and they kind of go around in the crevices, and they're looking for little eggs and insects and things like that. They are very disciplined in their foraging. They're looking for food, and they do it very carefully. So, that was the first thing that would come to mind. It's pretty easy to fit the woodpecker foraging behavior in there. But there's more to discipline than just that. There's the sacrifice for short-term benefits for longer-term benefits. So you might encounter some short-term cost working towards a longer-term goal. And the birds do that all the time. All animals do that all the time from a evolutionary or biological standpoint. Here is a scarlet tanager. I'm very pleased of this photo. It was in Maine, a wonderful spring day. This scarlet tanager is bright red, and it sings a lovely song. If you're a predator, which bird are you going to go eat, right? You're going to go look for that flashy one. So it's not a conscious decision on the bird in any way, but over generations, there's this trade-off. Do I be flashy and attract a mate, or do I act more like this spruce grouse here, and am I camouflaged? And here I'm not going to get eaten because the predator can hardly see me because I'm so camouflaged. But it might be a little bit more rough finding a mate. So here I'm really advertising for a mate. The grouse advertises for a mate too. But But this bird right here is certainly foregoing short-term benefits for long-term gains. The short-term benefit is avoiding getting eaten. The long-term gain is finding a mate and raising a nest. These birds here, probably have much greater predation than the spruce grouse. Did I call that a ruffed grouse earlier? It's a spruce grouse. And the great thing about the spruce grouse here, they don't live around here. You just go a little bit further north, and you've got spruce grouse, and you can literally walk up to these birds. I took this photo in Newfoundland. I went to a conference in Newfoundland. It was wonderful. And I was so excited that I got great pictures of this bird. It was my first encounter with a spruce grouse. I didn't realize that this is what they do. You can walk right up to this thing, and it's like, I'm camouflaged. You can't see me. It doesn't run away. It's just relying on its camouflage. And for that reason, they're called stick birds by the native Newfoundlanders, or Newfies. They're called stick birds because all you got to do for dinner is to walk up to the thing with a stick, and boom, you got supper. So do you want to be a stick bird, or do you want to be a scarlet tanager? That's a trade-off, short-term versus long-term. Back to the woodpeckers, when I was doing my study, there's something interesting about the downy woodpecker in particular, and that is that males, for instance, this guy right here, males typically forage on very small diameter branches and very small trees and that sort of thing. The females, when you're out in the woods, you typically see them on larger diameter substrates, bigger trunks and limbs. Turns out that we think that there's actually less food on these thicker trunks, but the female yet is still hanging around there, and so she has to have this trade-off. If she's hungry, she's actually going to move away from this male, go forage, get some food, and then she'll come back. The short-term goal there is to make sure you're not hungry. But the long-term goal is to maintain a relationship, a pair bond between male and female. And so these birds have and this is more of a conscious decision. We can't really define consciousness in non-human animals, but the birds are clearly thinking about whether I should associate with a mate right now or not. And that decision's based on their hunger level, it would appear. All right, the last Benedictine value I want to talk about is stewardship. And another woodpecker species is a wonderful example of this. This is the acorn woodpecker. And I studied these as a college internship out in California. And the acorn woodpecker, you might not have seen this guy before because he's a little small. He lives out in California, but you've heard him. Let's see. Can I do this? And this is terrible because it's like being taped forever on video. But you know what Woody Woodpecker sounds like, right? Well, the acorn woodpecker sounds like this. Now, the cartoonists went da-da-da-da-da-da-da, the cartoonists added that part. But the Hollywood artists, when they were drawing Woody Woodpecker, all they had to do was open the window, listen outside their studio, and they heard these birds, acorn woodpeckers. They probably heard the acorn woodpecker pecking on the studio, too, because these birds riddle barns and houses and dead standing trees with holes. They riddle them with holes. And then they stick little acorns in each hole, one acorn per hole. And they spend hours and hours and hours per day with an acorn stuck in their bill, trying to, is it going to fit in this hole? Nope, doesn't fit. Is it going to fit in this hole? And they just go from hole to hole looking for a place to stash the acorn. And we call that caching, storing the food for the winter. They survive on these acorns during the wintertime. California doesn't get the winter that we do, but still it becomes more dry, and their insect prey is much less common. So they survive on the acorns. So stewardship Birds, no problem. We got great examples of stewardship in birds. The acorn woodpecker is not the only one that stashes food. There's titmice around here, chickadees around here that do that too. Now, it doesn't take a lot of memory, actually, to remember where you put your acorns, because it all falls into this tree. If you can get to the tree, you know you're going to find your acorns. But stewardship isn't just about the wise use of material things, which this is illustrating. But stewardship requires good business practices, if you will. And for a bird to practice good business practice, it's got to have a really good memory sometimes. And so there's some birds, Clark's nutcracker, which is a bird out west. It's related to a jay. There's been studies on their memory, and you can actually give them some nuts to store. You take them into a laboratory, you give them a bunch of nuts. They hide the nuts in different places around the room. And then you take that nutcracker and you put it in a cage somewhere else for 3 years. And then you put him back in the same room where he had hid the nuts 3 years ago. And he'll go right to where he had hid the nuts. He knows exactly, he remembers just where he put the nuts. And so the birds, in order to have good stewardship, they have evolved these great memories and other features of their behavior that allow them to do this. Right now, I have a titmouse in the biology building. And it's not me, actually. My students have a titmouse that we caught. And we're trying to catch about 5 more for a study. And we'll be letting them go when we're done. But the titmouse is another bird that stores food on a shorter term basis, maybe from day to day or week to week. And I was blown away this week when we caught that titmouse. It had already been banded, and we had studied it last year. It was in captivity last year for about 3 weeks. And I know that because I put bands on its legs. And so when we put it in the laboratory, it's a bird cage, this big or so. And we've got food dishes. We feed it with mealworms. People can eat mealworms. I've never had them, but apparently they're good to a titmouse. Well, this titmouse, what normally happens is the titmouse is like crazy scared of you. You put it in the cage. It flutters around until you leave the room. And then it still flutters around for another half hour before it decides that, well, I'm trapped, can't go anywhere. Well, this titmouse, the one that I caught a year ago and just captured again, brought into the same laboratory, same cage probably. We put him in there, and what does he do? He doesn't flutter around. He perches on the little perch that we have in there, and he almost immediately goes to the food dish and he grabs some mealworms right in front of us. And I was amazed at that. That bird remembered being in that cage. It remembered where the food was. It remembered that the mealworms are good to eat. And it also remembered that we could stand right there and it wasn't going to do anything to it. So that's just a story about the memory that these birds have that allows them to be such good stewards of their material goods. I have this picture now of a cardinal. Because stewardship isn't just storing material goods, but it's the wise use of those goods. And in this case, the red coloration of the beak of the cardinal and of the feathers is due to something called keratin, the same chemical in carrots that gives carrots an orange color. And the brighter the plumage of a male cardinal, the more attractive he is to females. Now, keratin is hard to come by in a bird's daily diet. So the redder the bird, it means the better the diet of this male, and probably the better quality that male is. If he can find good things to eat himself, then that probably means he can supply his chicks with good things to eat. And so the redder the male, the better, and that's Again, something, it's like, jewelry or something. You wear a lot of jewelry, you're showing off the fact that you've got lots of resources. So this male is showing off his jewelry. I don't know if you can see it in this picture, but you see that little fluff of feathers right there? It's gray and not red. There's another fluff of feathers down there that's gray. And maybe you can see in the top of his head, there's a little bit of gray right there. It turns out that these feathers aren't completely red. It's just the tips of the feathers that are red. Because in fact, like right here, this is the tip of the feather, this is red, and then you follow it to its follicle, and this part is gray. So this is one feather right here, and maybe 30% of that feather is red. This is wise use of materials. You don't have to have a fully red feather, you just have to have the part that shows be red. This is a great illustration of stewardship of the rarity of resources. This is my end. This is the last slide that I show, just a nice couple seagulls from Seattle. I hope you, have food for thought. I hope you see now that, just because I'm a scientist doesn't mean that everything is black and white, and that that I look at these as just animals. These are part of my life, and it enriches my life, and I wouldn't do it otherwise. One last thought. Oh, no. Well, sure. There was something I missed on the very first slide, and that is I've always wanted to write a book like Richard Adams' Watership Down. Who's read that book, Watership Down? It's about a group of rabbits, and the rabbits are the main characters. They talk to one another, and they interact, and this warren of rabbits has culture. And the rabbits, you go into their burrow and they've done artwork, and they have a spiritual sense as well. As a scientist, I'd never write a book like that. But as Jim Kellam, I'd love to write a book like that. So thank you for your attention.